Hey friends, there are seasons of life where you begin to notice that your understanding of yourself isn't as settled as you once thought it was. It usually doesn't arrive in a dramatic way, and it's not always tied to a single moment that you can point to. It's more of a gradual awareness that begins to take shape over time. As you find yourself responding differently than you used to, thinking about things in new ways, or recognizing that parts of your identity don't feel as clearly defined as they once did. Sometimes that awareness can feel disorienting, even if nothing outwardly seems to have changed. You may find yourself trying to make sense of why certain things affect you more deeply now, or why something that once felt certain no longer feels clear. There can be a quiet tension in realizing that you are no longer who you used to be, while also not feeling like you have a firm grasp on who you're becoming yet. And in that space, it can be easy to feel like something is missing, not in an obvious way, but in a subtle sense that you should be able to explain yourself more easily than you can, and that you should have a clearer understanding of who you are by now, or a more stable sense of identity to stand on. It can create a quiet pressure to figure things out, to define what feels undefined, or to reach some kind of clarity that allows everything to feel settled again. But what if that feeling doesn't actually mean something is wrong? What if it doesn't mean you're behind, or that you've lost something you were supposed to hold on to? What if it simply means that you are in the middle of becoming, and that becoming doesn't always feel clear while you're inside of it? And maybe more importantly, what if the middle of that process, the parts of you that still feel unfamiliar, undefined, or unfinished, you are not as unknown as you might feel? As you sit in that space, the place where parts of you feel like they're unfolding, I want to bring a passage that has steadied people for generations, especially in seasons where identity feels unclear or still in process. In Psalms 139, David writes with a kind of honesty that doesn't try to resolve everything, but instead rests in something deeper than understanding. He begins by saying, "Lord, you have searched me and known me." And there's a quiet confidence in that statement that feels important to notice. He doesn't say, "You are learning me," or "You are figuring me out as I go." He speaks as though God's knowing is already complete, already established, already settled in a way that does not shift based on how clearly David understands himself in that moment. As the passage continues, it describes a God who is present in the smallest details, aware of movements, thoughts, intentions, and even the words that have not yet been spoken. It is a picture of being known in a way that is not partial or dependent on self-awareness, but full and continuous, even when your own understanding feels limited. That contrast becomes even clearer in the first epistle to the Corinthians, 13:12, where it says, "Now I know in part." There's an honesty there that leaves room for the reality most of us experience. We do not fully understand ourselves. There are parts of us that remain unclear, parts of us that we're still growing into, and parts that don't yet make sense in the way that we might want them to. But the verse does not leave you there. It continues with the reminder that feels steady beneath that uncertainty, that you are already fully known. Not someday, once everything becomes clear, and not eventually, when you finally understand yourself, but now. There's a fullness to God's knowing of you that is not waiting for clarity to catch up to it. The parts of you that feel unfamiliar are not unfamiliar to Him. The places where you feel unfinished are not incomplete in His sight. And that shifts something, because it means that your current experience of yourself, however partial, however in process you may feel, is not the measure of how fully you are known. There's a steadiness there that does not change while you are still becoming. When you begin to notice that your understanding of yourself feels incomplete, it can create a quiet kind of tension that is difficult to name. It isn't always loud, and it doesn't necessarily interrupt your day in obvious ways, but it can sit just beneath the surface of your thoughts, shaping the way you interpret your own reactions and the way you move through your relationships. You may find yourself pausing more often, not because you don't have thoughts or feelings, but because you aren't entirely sure how to describe them yet. There can be moments where something stirs inside of you and you recognize that it matters. But you don't yet have language to explain why. And in those moments, it can feel easier to stay quiet or simply to simplify what you say, not out of avoidance, but because you're still trying to understand it within yourself. Over time, that experience can begin to feel like a gap that you need to close. You might start to believe that clarity is something you should already have, or that understanding of yourself more fully is a requirement for showing up confidently in your life. It can create subtle pressure to define things more quickly than they were already defined, or simply so you can feel settled again. And yet, there's something deeply human about being in process. There's something honest about not having every part of yourself clearly mapped out at all times. Growth does not always move in a straight line, and self understanding rarely arrives all at once. More often, it comes in layers through lived experience, through reflection, through moments where you begin to see yourself a little more clearly than you did before. And while that process is unfolding, it can still feel uncomfortable. It can feel like standing in between versions of yourself, where the familiar is no longer fitting in the same way, and the new has not fully taken shape. And that in between space, it can be difficult to know how to describe who you are, even to yourself. And it can quietly affect how you show up because it is hard to stand firmly in something that still feels undefined. None of that means something is wrong. It means that something is still forming. And sometimes the hardest part of that formation is not the change in itself, but the uncertainty that comes along with it. The feeling of not quite having a language for who you are yet, the awareness that there are parts of you still unfolding in ways that you cannot fully see. And that can feel vulnerable in a way that is hard to explain, especially if you are used to being able to articulate your thoughts or clearly to present a steady sense of who you are to the people around you. When that steadiness feels less certain, it can feel like something important has shifted, even if the shift itself is part of the growth. And in that space, it can be easy to turn inward with questions that don't always have immediate answers. Questions about why you feel what you feel, or how to describe what is changing, or what it all means about who you're becoming. Those questions are not wrong, but they can begin to carry weight if they are tied to the expectation that you should already know. And maybe that's where we begin to feel the pressure the most. Not just to grow, but to understand the growth as it is happening. As that experience continues, there can be a subtle shift in the way that you relate to yourself, even if you don't immediately recognize it happening. When you don't fully understand what you are feeling or how to describe what is changing, it can become harder to trust your own internal sense of direction. You may find yourself second guessing reactions that once felt clear, or questioning whether what you are sensing is something you can rely on. That uncertainty can begin to create a kind of distance between you and your experience. Not a dramatic disconnection, but a quieter hesitation, a pause before you fully step into what you feel, because you're not entirely sure what it means yet. And in that hesitation, it can feel like you need more clarity before you can move forward with confidence. Over time, that can turn into a belief that understanding yourself is a prerequisite for being grounded, and that you can clearly define what is happening within you. Until you can clearly define what is happening within you, you are somehow not fully ready to show up as yourself. It can create a sense that identity is something that you need to stabilize before you can rest in it, rather than something that continues to take shape as you live. And that belief can be heavy in ways that are easy to overlook because it places the weight of certainty on process that is, by its nature, unfolding. It assumes that clarity should come before peace, when in reality, peace is often what allows clarity to grow slowly over time. When those things are reversed, it can feel like you are waiting to arrive at yourself before you are allowed to feel settled, and that waiting can quietly become exhausting. You may not describe it that way, but it can show up in the way that you keep turning things over in your mind and trying to understand them more fully so you can feel anchored again. It can show up in the way you search for the right language or the right explanation, the right definition that will make everything feel more clear. It can show up in the sense that once you figure it out, you will then feel more like yourself again. But what if that sense of arrival isn't meant to come all at once? What if the process of understanding yourself is not something you complete, but something that you continue to grow into? And what if in the middle of that process, you are not as ungrounded as you might feel? Because even as your understanding of yourself shifts and develops, there's something else that has not moved. God's knowing of you has not changed. Not in the response to you, not in response to your clarity, and not in response to your uncertainty. While you are still learning to recognize parts of yourself, He is not encountering them for the first time. While you are still finding language for what you feel, He's not waiting for you to explain it to Him before He understands it. The parts of you that feel unfamiliar are not unfamiliar to Him, and the places where you feel unfinished are not incomplete in His sight. That doesn't remove the experience of being in process, but it does place it within something more steady. It means that your unfolding is not happening in isolation. It is happening within a knowing that is already whole. As you continue to sit in seasons like this, it can begin to change the way you think about stability. When your understanding of yourself feels incomplete, it is easy to assume that something essential is missing, even if you can't quite define what that is. There can be a quiet sense that you are waiting to arrive at a clearer version of yourself before you are allowed to feel settled, as though the rest belongs on the other side of understanding. And because of that, it can sometimes feel like you are holding your place in your own life rather than fully inhabiting it. You are still moving forward, still showing up in your relationships, and still making decisions and continuing in your responsibilities. But underneath, there can be a subtle hesitation. It isn't a lack of willingness to be present, it's more a sense that you're not entirely sure of what you are standing on yet. And that uncertainty makes it harder to feel fully grounded where you are. That uncertainty can shape the way that you relate to yourself in ways that are easy to overlook. You may find yourself hesitating before you trust what you feel, or holding back from naming something too quickly because you're not sure that it will hold. There can be a quiet question underneath it all about whether you could fully explain yourself if you needed to. And that question can create a kind of distance that is difficult to put into words. It isn't that you're disconnected from yourself, but you are still getting acquainted with the parts of you who are. And that process can feel unfinished in a way that makes you cautious. Part of what makes that so tender is how closely we tend to connect being known with being clear. We often assume that in order to be known, we need to be able to articulate ourselves in a way that feels stable and understandable, as though clarity is the doorway to being seen. Without that clarity, it can feel like something important is missing, not in how we understand ourselves, but in how we are able to be known by others. But it is when you begin to sit with what we have already seen in Scripture that assumption starts to loosen. Being known has never been dependent on how clearly you could explain yourself. It was never contingent on your ability to define every part of who you are in a way that feels complete. The parts of you that are still forming are not hidden in the way that they might feel. And the places where you hesitate or struggle to find language are not outside of God's understanding. He is not waiting for you to organize those parts of yourself so that He can know them. He is not waiting for you to reach clarity before He can understand you. His knowing does not move in step with your self-awareness. It remains steady even while you are still discovering what is there. That means that the thoughts you cannot quite name, and the emotions that feel layered, and the parts of you that feel unfamiliar are already fully held within a knowing that is not incomplete. That kind of knowing is very different from what we are used to. It does not come together over time, and it does not rely on explanation. It is not limited by how clearly you can see yourself in a given moment. It is whole, and it remains whole even while you are in process. So instead of moving towards being known, as you become more clear, you are learning to recognize that you were already known while the clarity was unfolding. That does not remove the process of becoming, and it does not make everything feel resolved, but you are still learning yourself, still growing into parts of who you are becoming, and still moving through something that cannot be rushed. But that process is no longer something you have to endure in order to reach a place where you are fully seen. It is something you are allowed to live inside of, knowing that you are already fully known within it. And when that begins to settle in, even gradually, it can change the way you move through this season. Instead of trying to force clarity so you can feel grounded again, you're able to remain present where you are. You don't have to rush to define what is still forming, and you don't have to create language for something that is not ready to be named. You're allowed to stay within yourself in the middle of that process, even if parts of you still feel unfamiliar. What is often That is often where growth becomes gentler, not because everything is clear, but because you are no longer waiting to be known once it is. As you sit with all of this, there isn't anything you need to resolve right now. This isn't a moment to try to define yourself more clearly or to come up with a better language for what you're experiencing. It's not a place where you need to reach clarity before you can move forward. Instead, it is simply a space to notice what has already been present, even if it hasn't fully been named. You might begin by paying attention to where your own understanding of yourself feels incomplete. There may be areas of your life where your reactions surprise you, or where your thoughts feel layered in ways that are difficult to explain. There may be parts of you that feel unfamiliar, not because they don't belong to you, but because they are still in process. You are in the process of recognizing them. Rather than trying to close that gap, you can simply allow it to be seen. You can acknowledge that there are places where you do not yet fully have clarity, and at the same time hold the truth that those places are not unknown to God. That tension does not need to be resolved before it can be held. And maybe that leads you to a quieter kind of question that doesn't demand an immediate answer, but simply creates a space for awareness. Where in my life do I feel like I don't fully understand myself yet? And what would it look like to trust God in that He already knows me in that space? As you bring that question into prayer, you don't need to arrive with clarity. You can come exactly as you are, even if parts of you still feel undefined. God, you know us in ways that we are still learning to understand. You see the parts of our lives that feel clear to us, and you can see the places where we are still searching for language, still trying to make sense of what is changing within us. You are not limited by your understanding, and you are not waiting for us to become certain before you draw near. In the places where we feel unfinished, would you remind us that we are not unknown? In the parts of us that feel unfamiliar, would you help us to trust that nothing about us is hidden from you? You already see what we cannot fully see yet, and you hold it with a steadiness that does not shift. Release the pressure that we carry to figure ourselves out more quickly than we are meant to. Teach us what it looks like to live inside the process of becoming without trying to rush it. Help us to trust that growth can unfold slowly and that your knowing of us is not dependent on our clarity. Where we feel uncertain, bring a sense of grounding that does not come from having all the answers, but from knowing that we are fully seen. Where we feel hesitant to step into parts of ourselves that we do not understand, meet us with gentleness and patience. And as we continue to grow, help us to rest in the truth that we are already known, even here. Amen. As you move on into the rest of your week, I want you to carry this with you in a way that feels steady and unhurried. May you begin to experience a quiet sense of safety in the parts of your life that still feel undefined. May you feel less pressure to explain yourself perfectly and more freedom to grow at a pace that allows you to actually recognize what is unfolding within you. May you come to trust that being known is not something that you earn through clarity, but something that you already hold, even while your understanding is still developing. And as you continue to discover who you are, may you find that you are not moving toward being seen, but learning to rest in the truth that you already are. And may that truth create a space for you to grow slowly, without fear that anything about you is fully unknown or unseen. If this resonated, you might want to sit with episode 23, When Belonging Shaped Who You Became. It explores how the environments you belong to influence who you learn to be and how that can shape your sense of identity over time. Or maybe Devotional 12, Faithfulness Without Pressure. If you've been carrying the weight of needing to have everything figured out, it holds that tension in a way that may feel steady and grounding. Thanks for spending this time with me today. If this devotional met you in a place that still feels unfinished or hard to name, I want you to know that there's a space for you to continue exploring that without needing to rush it. You can find companion guides, devotionals, and a guided path through these themes at the Healer and Hope Giver website, www.healerhopegiver.com, where everything is designed to help you move at your own pace and choose what feels most helpful in this season. And if this episode resonated with you, one of the simplest ways you can help someone else find the space is by sharing it. You never know who might need to hear something like this at the exact moment they are trying to make sense of their own story. And if you haven't already, you can follow the podcast where you listen so these Monday conversations and Thursday devotionals can meet you in a steady rhythm each week. And if you prefer YouTube, you can find everything there as well. If something in this episode stayed with you, I'd love to hear about it. You can always message me through social media or through the website. I read every single message. What you share often helps me understand what needs to be revisited or explored more deeply, or even carried into future conversations. We'll continue this together on Monday with our next long-form episode, and then meet back here on Thursday. And as you go, just remember, you are not unknown, you are unfolding.